I never imagined that 40 feet of limestone to become the center of a neighborhood war, but that's exactly what happened. And the strangest part is that the wall never failed, never cracked, never caused a single complaint. It simply stood there for 4 years doing its job until one man decided that appearances mattered more than engineering. Looking back now, I don't think the HOA was ever trying to improve the neighborhood. I think they just wanted to prove they could tell someone what to do. And unfortunately for them, they picked the wrong project to test that theory on. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I live in a quiet subdivision just outside Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, the kind of place where people wave from their porches, neighbors borrow ladders instead of buying them, and everyone claims they're here because they wanted to get away from unnecessary drama. When my wife and I bought our house 6 years ago, the property wasn't perfect, but we saw potential. The backyard overlooked a gentle valley. Mature oak trees framed the fence line, and every evening the sunset painted the entire hillside in shades of orange that made the long workdays feel worthwhile. There was only one real problem. Our lot sat nearly 3 feet lower than the 3 homes behind us, and every heavy rain turned that slope into a river aimed directly at my backyard. Before we moved in, I spent my career as a civil construction superintendent overseeing grading projects, drainage systems, and retaining structures across 3 states, so I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't something a few bags of mulch could solve. I hired a geotechnical engineer, paid for a full soil analysis, and waited patiently for the report. His conclusion wasn't dramatic, but it was clear. Without a retaining structure, gradual erosion would eventually destabilize the slope, damage the drainage path, and threaten multiple properties downhill. I wasn't about to gamble my retirement on hope, so I did everything by the book. I submitted engineering drawings to the county, obtained a grading permit, passed every inspection, and hired a licensed contractor to build a 40-foot limestone retaining wall with perforated drain pipe, gravel backfill, and filter fabric exactly as specified in the approved plans. The project cost me just over $22,000, enough money that I remembered joking with my wife that I had just bought the most expensive pile of rocks in Tennessee. She laughed and reminded me that peace of mind usually isn't cheap. She was right. For the next 4 years, that wall quietly did exactly what it had been designed to do. During every thunderstorm, I watched runoff disappear behind the drainage system instead of pouring across my lawn. My backyard stayed level. The shared walking path below remained dry. Even the neighbors uphill unknowingly benefited because the wall safely controlled the pressure from the slope supporting part of their own yards. Nobody ever stopped to admire it, and honestly, that's exactly how good infrastructure works. If people notice it every day, something is probably wrong. Then everything changed after our HOA elected a new president named Randall Mercer. Randall wasn't the loudest person in the neighborhood. In fact, he rarely raised his voice. What made him difficult was something far more dangerous. He genuinely believed that holding the title of HOA president made him the final authority on almost everything. He walked around community events wearing an embroidered HOA badge clipped to his shirt like it meant something official, quoted bylaws during casual conversations, and somehow found a way to turn every discussion into a reminder that community standards protect property values. At first, most of us laughed about it. The board started sending reminders about mailbox colors, approved mulch varieties, holiday decorations that stayed up too long, and grass that exceeded the maximum height by an inch or two. It felt ridiculous, but mostly harmless. Then the violation notices became more frequent. Gary Whitlock, my neighbor across the street, received one because his work truck displayed magnetic business signs. Mrs. Peep Alvarez got fined because the flowers in her front planters weren't considered seasonal enough. Someone else received a warning over a basketball hoop visible from the road. Little by little, the neighborhood changed. Conversations became quieter. People looked over their shoulders before complaining. Every trip to the mailbox came with a strange feeling that maybe today would be your turn. One Tuesday afternoon, I pulled into my driveway after picking up supplies from the hardware store when Gary walked over carrying his coffee mug. He didn't smile like he usually did. Instead, he asked, "Have you checked your mailbox today?" I told him I hadn't. He looked down for a second before saying, "You probably should." There was something in his voice that made my stomach tighten before I even opened the mailbox. Buried between grocery coupons and a utility bill was a white envelope with the HOA logo stamped across the corner. I opened it standing right there beside the driveway. Violation. Notice. Reason. Non-compliant retaining wall materials inconsistent with established community aesthetic standards. Correct within 30 days or incur weekly fines of $150. I actually laughed because I honestly believed someone had made a mistake. Then I looked again and saw my name printed across the top. That evening, I walked the full length of the wall carrying the letter in one hand. It looked exactly as it had the day the county inspector approved it. Every block remained perfectly aligned. No cracks, no leaning, no movement. It wasn't just structurally sound. It was protecting far more than my backyard. The next morning, I unlocked the filing cabinet in my home office and spread every document across the dining room table. The county grading permit, the engineering report, soil analysis, survey, inspection approvals, construction invoices, drainage calculations. I spent nearly 3 hours reading every page of our HOA governing documents, convinced I'd somehow overlooked a rule. Instead, I found absolutely nothing. The CC&Rs covered paint colors, fences, sheds, landscaping, satellite dishes, even basketball hoops, but not a single sentence restricted retaining walls that had already received municipal approval. That afternoon, I'd prepared a formal appeal, attached every supporting document, highlighted the relevant sections, and mailed it certified because experience had taught me that paperwork wins arguments long before emotions ever do. 2 weeks later, I attended the monthly HOA meeting at the clubhouse. Nearly every seat was filled. Word had spread. When my turn arrived, I calmly placed my folder on the table and asked one simple question. Could someone please show me which section of our governing document says my retaining wall violates HOA rules? Randall leaned back in his chair, folded his hands together, and gave me the same confident smile I'd seen him wear dozens of times before. Mr. Point Teen Trive. Caldwell, he said, the board has discretionary authority to preserve the appearance of the community. I nodded slowly before asking another question. So there isn't actually a written rule? The room became unusually quiet. A few neighbors exchanged glances. Someone near the back let out a nervous chuckle. Randall's smile disappeared. The board has already voted, he replied. Your appeal is denied. I looked down at the paperwork I'd spent hours preparing, closed the folder without another word, and simply said, I understand. I wasn't agreeing with him. I had simply realized something he hadn't. And before long, that realization would change the entire neighborhood. Walking out of that clubhouse, I wasn't angry the way most people probably expected. I wasn't plotting revenge, and I certainly wasn't looking for a courtroom battle. If anything, I felt strangely calm, because Randall had just answered the only question that really mattered. He hadn't pointed to a rule. He hadn't challenged my engineering report. He hadn't disputed my property survey. His entire argument boiled down to one sentence, because the board said so. I drove home with the windows down, parked in my driveway, and sat there for a few minutes looking at the retaining wall through the windshield. 4 years earlier, I'd built it because gravity doesn't care about opinions, and water certainly doesn't care about neighborhood aesthetics. Nature follows physics, not HOA newsletters. That evening, my wife Claire noticed I barely touched dinner. She asked whether I was going to hire an attorney, and I surprised both of us when I shook my head. Not yet, I told her. There's something I need to confirm first. The next morning, I visited the county engineering office carrying the same folder I'd taken to the HOA meeting. A county engineer named Melissa Dawson recognized the permit number almost immediately. She pulled the file from their archive, reviewed the inspection history, and smiled. Everything looks exactly the way I remember it, she said. That wall passed every inspection. I slid the violation letter across her desk. She read it twice before looking back at me. They're asking you to remove this? I nodded. Melissa leaned back in her chair for a moment before choosing her words carefully. Mr. Point, that mistake. Caldwell, the county can't tell you to keep a retaining wall on private property if you decide to remove it. But I strongly recommend documenting every step if the removal isn't your decision. That sentence stayed with me. Document everything. I thanked her, went back home, and spent the rest of the afternoon writing another letter. This one wasn't addressed to the HOA. It went to the county grading department. In clear, professional language, I explained that I intended to remove a county-approved retaining wall solely because the Homeowners Association had ordered its removal under threat of recurring fines. I included copies of the violation notice, the appeal denial, photographs of the existing structure, and a request that the correspondence become part of the permanent property record. I mailed it certified the same afternoon. Then I waited 3 days. No response from the HOA. No compromise, no phone call. Just another reminder that my compliance deadline was approaching. That's when I made my decision. Saturday morning, a flatbed trailer rolled into my driveway carrying pallets and lifting equipment. My contractor from 4 years earlier, Mike Donnelly, climbed out of his truck wearing the exact same faded baseball cap I'd seen him wear on the original project. He looked at the wall, then at the violation notice I'd handed him, and frowned. "You're serious?" he asked. "Unfortunately, this thing's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. I know, removing it isn't going to improve anything. I know that too." He stared at me for another few seconds before quietly saying, "Well, it's your property." By 8 o'clock, we started removing the limestone blocks one section at a time. There was no demolition, no smashing, no dramatic machinery. Every block was lifted carefully, cleaned off, and stacked neatly on wooden pallets along my driveway. Anyone driving by would have thought we were preserving valuable stone for another project, because in a way, we were. Gary wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee and stood beside me watching the excavator lift another section into the air. "Please tell me you've lost your mind," he said with a nervous laugh. I handed him the violation letter. He read it, sighed, and looked back toward the hill behind my yard. "Randall actually thinks this is a good idea?" Apparently. Gary shook his head slowly. "You know what's holding back half that slope, right?" I smiled. "I have a pretty good idea." "Does he?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Over the next 2 days, the wall disappeared completely. Behind it, the drainage pipe remained exposed for only a few hours before we safely removed it as well. The gravel backfill came out. The filter fabric came out. Every engineered component that had quietly protected the hillside for years was gone. By Monday afternoon, nothing remained except the original natural slope. Before leaving, Mike walked over and looked at the bare hillside one last time. "If we get a hard rain before someone rebuilds this," he said quietly, "I'd stay off the walking trail." I nodded. "I appreciate your honesty." Meanwhile, Randall seemed delighted. He actually stalked his SUV outside my house Tuesday morning while I was loading the last pallet of limestone. Rolling down his window, he smiled like a man congratulating himself. "Looks much cleaner already," he said. "The neighborhood appreciates your cooperation." I leaned against the pallet jack and asked, "Have you ever seen the engineering report for this project?" "I don't need to. The appearance speaks for itself." I almost laughed. Instead, I simply replied, "Let's hope appearance is enough." He drove away without another word, probably convinced he'd won. Within days, the bare slope began changing in subtle ways only someone with my background would notice. Tiny surface cracks appeared after light irrigation. Small channels formed where runoff naturally surged for the easiest path downhill. Nothing dramatic, not yet. Claire caught me standing on the patio one evening staring at the hill. "You're worried," she said. "I'm respectful," I answered. "There's a difference." Weather forecasts started mentioning a slow-moving storm system expected to arrive the following weekend. Most people heard heavy rain and thought about umbrellas. I heard soil saturation, hydrostatic pressure, reduced friction, and gravity doing exactly what gravity has done since the beginning of time. Thursday afternoon, Gary knocked on my door again. "Randall's telling everyone the neighborhood looks better already," he said. I couldn't help smiling. "Is he?" Gary nodded. "He's taking credit for improving property values." I looked past him toward the now unprotected hillside and quietly said, "Sometimes the most expensive mistakes are the ones that look successful at first." Friday evening, the sky turned dark much earlier than usual. Thick clouds rolled over the ridge while distant thunder echoed across the valley. Claire closed the patio umbrella before the wind could catch it, and I brought the outdoor chairs into the garage. Around midnight, the rain finally arrived. At first, it sounded gentle against the roof, almost relaxing, but within an hour, it became the kind of steady downpour that soaks every inch of ground until the earth simply can't absorb another drop. I stood at the kitchen window watching water race down the hillside exactly where my retaining wall had quietly redirected it for 4 years. The flashlight in my hand reflected off sheets of rain as narrow streams merged into wider channels, slowly carving fresh paths through soil that no longer had anything holding it in place. Claire walked up beside me and whispered, "Do you think it'll be okay?" I watched another ribbon of muddy water disappear into the darkness before answering. Nature always keeps perfect records. Sooner or later, every decision gets audited. By sunrise, the storm had finally moved east, but the silence outside felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes after something has already gone wrong. I stepped onto the back patio with a cup of coffee, and before I even reached the railing, I could see it. The hillside had shifted, not collapsed in one dramatic avalanche like you see on television, but slowly, relentlessly, exactly the way saturated soil always fails. Thousands of pounds of wet earth had crept downhill overnight, pushing muddy debris across the rear patios of the two homes below, burying sections of the shared walking path, and filling drainage channels with thick clay. One decorative fence leaned at an awkward angle. Landscaping stones had disappeared beneath the mud, and the neat green slope Randall had been so proud of just days earlier now looked like someone had dragged a giant shovel through the middle of it. Within an hour, county trucks started arriving. By lunchtime, engineers, inspectors, and public works employees were walking the site with clipboards, laser levels, and cameras. Nobody knocked on my door first. They went straight to the damaged slope. Around noon, an inspector named Kevin Brooks finally walked over carrying a tablet. "Mr. Caldwell?" he asked. "Yes, sir. We received your documentation before the wall was removed." I nodded and invited him onto the patio. He spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the photographs I had taken before construction, during construction, after the final inspection, and while the wall was being removed. Then he looked at the violation letter from the HOA, compared it with my certified notice to the county, and quietly shook his head. "Who instructed you to remove the retaining structure?" he asked. I slid the HOA letter across the table. He read it once, then a second time, before slipping it into his folder. "Thank you," he said. "That answers my question." By late afternoon, yellow caution tape surrounded the damaged walking path, and temporary erosion barriers were being installed to prevent another slide if more rain arrived. The county's preliminary findings were straightforward. The original retaining wall had been legally permitted, professionally engineered, and functioning exactly as intended. Its removal had eliminated the primary structure stabilizing that section of slope, allowing predictable soil movement during the first major storm. In other words, the hillside hadn't failed because the engineering was bad. It failed because the engineering had been ordered removed. Randall called me 3 times that Friday. I let every call go to voicemail. The 4th time he left a message. His voice sounded nothing like the confident man from the HOA meeting. "Ethan, maybe we should sit down and discuss rebuilding the wall. I'm sure we can work something out." I listened to the message once, deleted it, and went back to enjoying my coffee. 2 weeks later, the HOA held another community meeting, but this one felt very different. The room was packed with frustrated homeowners asking why common property had been damaged, why emergency repairs were being discussed, and why the board had ignored engineering documents that several people now knew had existed all along. Randall tried explaining that the board had acted in the community's best interest, but every answer only led to another question. Then Gary stood up from the 3rd row and calmly asked the one question nobody could escape. "Did anyone on this board consult an engineer before ordering that wall removed?" The room fell completely silent. Nobody answered because nobody could. Over the following months, the HOA faced repair costs, legal consultations, insurance questions, and more than one board resignation. I rebuilt my retaining wall later that year using the exact same county-approved plans, because gravity hadn't changed its mind just because someone had lost an election. Every time I walk into my backyard now, I still look at those limestone blocks, but I don't see revenge or victory. I see a reminder that facts don't become less true because they're unpopular, and nature doesn't negotiate with pride. The wall never needed to prove it was important. It did that the first time it wasn't there. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought the HOA in court from the beginning? Or would you have done exactly what I did and simply complied with their demand, knowing the consequences would speak louder than any argument ever could? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, that's one conversation I'd love to hear. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever dealt with an HOA that confused authority with common sense. I'll see you in the next one.